Now this morning, I don't want to be rude. Did anybody else want one of these? No? Okay. All right. Just thought I would ask. You know, William Henry Harrison was the last president born as an English subject before the American Revolution. He was a native of Virginia, and he attended college with the intent of studying medicine. But he opted to join the Army before he finished with his degree. Now, President John Adams took note of Harrison's exemplary service in the Indian Wars of the Northwest Territories, and in 1801 made him the governor of the Northwest Territories. And that was, at that time, Northwest was Indiana and Illinois. Harrison later fought in the Battle of the Thames River during the War of 1812 and went on to become a congressman and the ambassador to Columbia before running with John Tyler on the Whig Party ticket in the presidential election of 1840. Now, much to the horror of the political establishment of the time, they campaigned in a very vigorous style, considered very unseemly for their era. They used Harrison's nickname, Tippecanoe, which he earned during a brutal Indian War campaign at Tippecanoe Creek, and concocted the slogan, Tippecanoe and Tyler too. Harrison and Tyler had boisterous rallies during which they handed out free bottles of hard cider in little log cabin-shaped bottles. In other words, they knew how to buy votes. Their tactics, however controversial, were successful. On March the 4th in 1841, Harrison was sworn in as the 9th U.S. president. Now, it was during the inaugural address that things began to go wrong. On a horribly wintry day, complete with a snowstorm, Harrison delivered the longest inaugural address in history, which may well have been his undoing. The first presidential speech delivered on a bitterly cold March morning clocked in at 1 hour and 45 minutes. 1 hour and 45 minutes standing in a snowstorm in Washington. Harrison went to bed at the end of the inauguration day with a bad cold that developed into a fatal case of pneumonia. Thus, Harrison served the shortest term in office, a mere 32 days, most of which was spent trying to recover from the illness brought on by his excessive and record-setting presidential speech. Now, just to give you an idea of how long that speech was in comparison, most presidential speeches now last about half an hour, maybe at the most 40 minutes. So imagine standing in a snowstorm in Washington, D.C., huddling together, maybe around fire buckets or something, I don't know, and listening to this address. An hour and 45 minutes in the snow. I think about that. I think about how unreal that must have been. Now, this morning, we're going to talk a little bit about the idea of a royal speech. It's not so much presidential in the Psalms, but it's a royal speech, and it's a declaration, most likely, that was written for the inauguration of a Davidic king. So this is kind of the Hebrews version of an inaugural speech. The only difference is this was one that got used over and over and over. In other words, when there was a new king that came in or whenever there was a special holiday to celebrate, this psalm was read as a reminder to the people. And so it's not really directed so much at a specific king, but at the office of king. It is both traditional and socio-culturally probable that this represents how the dynasty, the Davidic dynasty of kings, wanted to be understood, how they wanted to be viewed by the public. I think that's an important idea. I think it's important to understand that this is most likely how the Davidic kings wanted to be remembered. It's important because it says to the people, this is who we should be. They're making a declaration about what it means to be the king of Israel. Now, the stories of the kings from Saul to Zedekiah in the north and Jehoiakim in the south are stories of men who were being given the task of becoming vassal rulers under the leadership of God. The understanding of how this works goes back to Saul and Samuel when God gave in to the pleading of the Israelite people and gave them a king. They wanted to be like all the other nations around them. They wanted to have a king too. If you want to go back and read this story, it's in 1 Samuel, I believe chapter 8, chapter 9. But it goes all the way back to that. And the Israelites, they wanted a king. They wanted somebody that they could see ruling over them. The king that they got was sort of a concessionary king in some ways. Because if you look at the scriptures and you understand the words that are used for king there, the words really don't imply a sovereign so much as a prince. In other words, this was somebody who was supposed to be the princely ruler under God the king. And so the way that this worked was the king would become the implementer of God's justice. And this would be relayed through the prophets to the king, so the king would know what justice looked like. The king was to act as the implementer of this justice, which he would use as kind of his template for what the rule was supposed to look like. For example, Samuel, as the man of God, would hear from God the things that God wanted the people of Israel to do. And then Saul was tasked with implementing what God spoke through the prophet Samuel. So, in this understanding, he's sort of a vassal ruler, a prince, and the true ruler of Israel is actually still Adonai. Another way of seeing this would be that this was in direct contrast to all the other kingdoms around them. All the other kingdoms around them had these autocratic rulers who just told the people what to do, and whatever they said was what the gods wanted. Whereas in Israel, God said, and then the king was supposed to do that. Now, we know from Israel's history, it's not exactly what happened. We know from Israel's history that while the kings would want to be remembered as those who lived in this role well as defender of the people and executor of the Lord's justice and righteousness, it did not always happen that way. And if you follow the story of Israel through the Old Testament, you'll find that most of the kings, well, they didn't do so well. There's a phrase that popped up over and over and over in the Old Testament that says, essentially, and he did evil in God's eyes. If you look at the stories of the kings, that phrase pops up over and over, and he did evil in God's eyes. But if the king did good in God's eyes, and there were a few, then it would lead to the country being at shalom, or well-being with itself. The Hebrew king, according to one theologian, lives under the scrutiny of God. If he rules with justice and righteousness, the troubles of the poor would cease, and the whole of God's community would prosper. So if the king does what God has instructed him to do, things go well. If the king doesn't do what God has instructed him to do, things fall apart. Now this leads us to ask this question. What does this look like? Or better still, how did the people understand the role of the king in Psalm 72? Well, it's a matter of the king living in the righteousness of God according to the covenant God made with Israel in the Torah. Since the standard of judgment is the covenant law of God, righteousness can acquire the sense of behavior in conformity with the covenant requirements. This brings about the possibility that right covenant standing with God can be observed as ordinary behavior. In other words, the proper way to behave can become the norm for society. It's the king's job to implement this, live by it himself, and then have the people follow in what the king is doing. In addition, the king, the judge, whomever, must conform to a different sense of righteousness. He must try things fairly. He must be true to the law and the covenant. They must condemn evil. They must not show partiality. They must uphold the cause of the defenseless. The righteousness of the king, in other words, was to be a mirror image of the righteousness of God, which is promised to the people of God in their need for protection and to those individual members who depend on assistance. This sovereignty truly belongs to Adonai, to God. And all the psalmist wishes and claims for the king is a murky reflection of the heavenly reign of God. This keeps the weak from becoming prey to the mighty. The expansion of the king's power is motivated in the verses 12 through 15 by righteousness and compassion for the weak and for those who he is supposed to deliver from violence. As the earthly representative of God on earth, it's his responsibility, because this is what God feels, and this is what the person occupying the office of earthly ruler is expected to live by, with respect to the life and dignity of individual human beings. This creates a bond between those who have been cared for and their king who cares for them. And it mirrors the idea that God cares for them, because the appointed ruler that God has placed over them is showing them how God would behave on their behalf. This is what brings about peace in the kingdom. This is what is regarded as righteousness in this particular psalm. Now, with that in mind, we come to the psalm itself. The righteousness term here is used as a passage, in this passage, as a term for world order. Now, the central idea being that a righteous king offers a world order in which justice for the poor and deliverance from exploitation are the norm. Specifically, they enact measures to remedy the effect of oppression put in hand by kings, high officials, or others. In other words, it's the king's responsibility to stamp out injustice and to enact righteousness everywhere that they go. It was the place of the king to make this their first and organizing responsibility on which everything else depended. This saving justice and righteousness for the helpless is the definitive mark of the reign of God, and that which signifies the one who is Lord of all. This was a common idea among the prophets of Israel in the 8th century and following. In other words, when the prophets preached constantly, these ideas of saving justice and righteousness showed up in their messages. If you go back and you read through Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Daniel, these themes show up over and over and over. The king is responsible for distributing shalom, well-being of God, from God to the people. The king is to be a conduit, a channel through which God's blessing makes its way to the people. And this is largely due to the fact that at the time, the people believed that the king, any king of that time period, regardless of what country they were from, spoke for the deity or deities of their land. When the king says, "Thus says our gods or goddesses," the people assumed it must be true due to the elevated position of the king, which apparently came from the gods. Throughout the Old Testament stories, we see that people of Israel followed in the religious and social mistakes of the king, in spite of warnings to the contrary by generation after generation of prophets. It worked kind of like this. My son, I noticed, started mimicking some of the things that I do, some of my attitudes at one point. I don't know if anybody's ever seen this or not, but I'm a little bit temperamental sometimes. Okay, those of you that are laughing probably have seen it. Okay, good for you. Or bad for you, I'm sorry. And I didn't really notice how much of it was rubbing off until one day I watched my son get mad about something. And I realized that the facial expressions that he was making and the way that he was huffing and the way that he stomped off, it looked like a miniature version of me. And I got to thinking about that, and do I really look like that? That is ridiculous. And then I realized, yes, I do look like that. That is pretty ridiculous. If anybody ever sees me get mad, they'll see just how ridiculous that really is. Well, this is the kind of thing that people did in the Old Testament. Whatever the king did, the people did. Remember the story that we read in the book of Kings about Elijah? And we read about how Elijah went up to Mount Carmel And he came down after that great victory, and he went off and hid the cave. He thought, oh, woe is me. There's nobody left that really worships God. And he thought he was all alone. Now, why would he think that he's all alone? It's because he couldn't see anybody else that believed what he believed and was acting the way he acted. Now, of course, God told him he wasn't all alone. Told him there were other prophets around. But to his eye, what he was seeing was that the country was following King Ahab and all the things that King Ahab had done. And so there's a sense in which the king sets the tempo. They set the theme for how people live. Their job is to set the theme that God is a righteous and just God, and that living in God's righteousness and justice, especially for the poor, especially for those in need, is a mirror image of what it is to live as God would have us to live. This is the ideal, that a king would be the kind of king that the people could follow after, if that ruler could accept their place as one who engages in and creates the expectation that others are to engage in righteousness and justice of God. That is, a king who by example shows people what it means to be a people who live by these things. The desire of the psalmist, and by extension the nation's prayer, is, God, give your judgments to the king, give your righteousness to the king's son. In other words, show the king what leads us to a life of well-being, so we can know how you want us to live. Why? Why would they ask this question? Why would they pray this prayer? Well, the psalmist answers it in verse 12. Let it be so, because he delivers the needy who cry out, the poor and those who have no helper. He has compassion on the weak and the needy. He saves the lives of those in need. He redeems their lives from oppression and violence. Their blood is precious in his eyes. This is not a declaration of what the king has done, because we see by the stories of the Old Testament that many and most of the kings fall short. But this is the role as it should be. The ideal king, if he listened to God and lived in that way. And notice who benefits the most from this way of life. Those in the greatest of need. Those who are needy, poor. Those who have no deliverer. The weak. Those under oppression and violence. Those are the ones that God would have the king, and by extension his kingdom, deliver and have compassion on. Redeem and save, because their blood is precious in the eyes of the greater king, the King of heaven. And this is why I believe that the writer of Luke has Jesus read the prophet Isaiah in chapter 4, where he says, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me. He sent me to preach good news to the poor, proclaim release to the imprisoned, recovery of sight to the blind, to liberate the oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. This is about, in large part, what just rule looks like. And so now we have to ask ourselves a few questions. Why did the people write this down? Why did they feel the need to put words to this? Or better yet, why tell the story this way through this psalm? Well, people wrote this down to remember that the poor of their country, those who are needy, poor, those who have no deliverer, the weak, those who live under oppression and violence, needed a champion. And that champion was supposed to be their king. A king who acted as God would act on their behalf. The people wanted a reminder to read with each king, with each holiday fest, with every other occasion that these words were read, a reminder that this is what shalom, or well-being, looks like. That it was a place where those who were in need and cried out could be heard and rescued. If this is the answer to the why question, what do we do with it? How do we respond? It seems to me that despite what many people have said to do otherwise, the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament, the God of the Jews and of the Christians, is the same God. The God we're speaking of is one who cares for and answers those in need and calls us through the prophets, the writers, the teachings of the Torah, and the teachings of Jesus to be a people who in His name become deliverers to the poor, the needy, the oppressed, the depressed, the unimpressed, the stressed, the detested, and the plain forgotten about. If we are what we claim to be, little Christs, our objective is the emulation of the flesh and the spirit. Ultimately, love of God, love of neighbor, all our neighbors, red and yellow, black and white, as the song says, becomes our reason for being, that the hands and the feet of Jesus may continue to find their way to love and to serve those that God would continue to love and to serve through us. This we ask not only to be our prayer, but to be our way of life. In the name of the Father, of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.